Gravity didn't just fail. It was stolen. One moment, I was standing on teak that cost more than most houses, and the next, the horizon tilted violently sideways. The impact was a sledgehammer, a freezing shock that paralyzed my lungs instantly. I watched the Aurelia's lights drift away, a golden constellation indifferent to my struggle. The ocean was vast, dark, and utterly unimpressed by who I was. In the boardroom, I could buy my way out of anything. Here, swallowing salt water in the crushing black, I realized my portfolio meant nothing to the tide. I didn't charter the Aurelia for the sun. I chartered her for the silence. My life back in the city was a cacophony of demands, hostile takeovers, board decisions, the relentless noise of being the person everyone needed to satisfy. I was a strategist who saw corners before anyone else turned them, living in a state of perpetual high-stakes performance. I didn't want a vacation. I wanted a fortress. The yacht was exactly that, 100 feet of sleek Italian engineering designed to keep the world out. It was a masterpiece of isolation, all soundproofed walls and climate-controlled indifference, a place where I could finally exhale. Or it would have been, if not for the captain, Reese. Even her name sounded like a friction burn. She wasn't the polished, invisible service staff I was accustomed to. She was raw capability wrapped in a uniform that fit her a little too well. She moved with a predator's precision, efficient and silent, every step on the deck calculated to manage risk rather than seek approval. When we first met on the aft deck, she didn't offer a practiced smile. She offered a firm handshake and a gaze so direct it felt like she was reading the fine print on my soul. Her eyes were gray, the color of a storm front, and they held an unflinching weight that unsettled me. She looked at me not as the owner of the charter, but as a variable she hadn't yet solved. The conflict began before we even left the dock. The afternoon sky had turned a bruised, sullen purple, and the air in the harbor hung heavy and wet. I was in the salon, pouring a drink I didn't need, when Reese entered. She didn't knock. She simply occupied the space. She stood with her feet planted wide, bracing against a roll that hadn't happened yet. "We need to stay put, Miss Vance," she said. Her voice was low, a rough alto that vibrated in the quiet room. Barometers dropping fast. It's going to get ugly out there. I swirled the ice in my glass, annoyed by the intrusion. "I have a schedule, Captain. I need to be in open water by sunset. I didn't pay this much to stare at a concrete wall and other people's masts." "You paid for a safe passage," she countered, her expression unmoving. "The sea doesn't care about your schedule. Or your money." That was the moment the dynamic shifted. In my world, resistance was just a negotiation tactic, a prelude to me getting my way. I looked at her, really looked at her. There was a challenge in her stance, a rigid adherence to protocol that I found infuriatingly attractive and deeply inconvenient. Her denial was a wall built of glass and expectation. She wasn't trying to please me. She was trying to protect her vessel. But I saw it as a test of wills. "I'm aware of the risks," I lied. I wasn't. I was aware of my own desire to escape the noise. "We sail. Unless you're telling me you can't handle a little weather?" It was a cheap shot, and we both knew it. Reese's jaw tightened, a small muscle jumping in her cheek. She looked at me for a long, charged silence. The air between us thickened, heavy with what we didn't say. She wasn't intimidated by my tone. She was assessing me, and I had the distinct feeling I had just failed a test I didn't know I was taking. It was a look that stripped away the title of CEO and left just a woman standing on a boat she didn't understand. "Your call," she said finally, her voice devoid of warmth. "But when the swells hit, you stay off the deck. That's not a request." She turned on her heel and left, taking all the oxygen in the room with her. I stood there, triumphant but strangely hollow. I had bought my way out of the delay, used my authority to override her expertise. I felt powerful. I felt in control. We cast off 20 minutes later. As the Aurelia cut through the harbor mouth, the water was already turning choppy, slapping against the hull with a rhythmic, warning thud. I stood by the glass doors, watching the coastline fade. The air felt electric, charged with the coming violence. I should have felt fear. Instead, I felt a strange magnetic pull toward the bridge, toward the woman who had looked at me with such terrifying clarity. I ignored the warning in my gut, the sensory alarm bells ringing in the humid air. I finished my drink and told myself I had won. I didn't know yet that arrogance is just a calm before the drowning. The weather shifted with a terrifying efficiency. It wasn't the dramatic, cinematic explosion of thunder I had expected from the safety of movies. It was a dismantling. The sky simply ceased to be a ceiling and became a weight, pressing down until the horizon was erased by a wall of gray water. The temperature plummeted, sucking the humidity from the air and replacing it with a biting, salt-laden chill that found its way through the glass of the salon doors. The rhythm of the Aurelia changed too. The steady, confident hum of the engines was replaced by a laboring vibration, a mechanical groan as the hull fought against physics it could no longer ignore. I stood in the center of the salon, watching my reflection in the darkened glass ghost over the chaos outside. The wine in my glass tilted at an impossible angle, defying gravity for a split second before splashing onto the carpet. It was a small disorder, a stain on the pristine cream wool, but it irritated me disproportionately. It was evidence that my control was slipping. Outside, on the aft deck, a lounge chair, heavy teak and custom upholstery, broke free from its lashings. It slid across the wet wood with a sickening scrape, slamming into the railing. That was the trigger. It wasn't logical. It was a reflex of ownership. I didn't call the crew. I didn't page Reese. I simply set my glass down and moved toward the sliding doors. I needed to secure the environment. I needed to put things back in their place. I convinced myself it was a simple task, a moment of exertion to restore order. I pressed the button to open the door, and the wind hit me like a solid object, a physical blow that nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. The sound was deafening, a roar that drowned out the engines, the sea, and my own common sense. I stepped out. The deck was slick, coated in a mixture of rain and sea spray that felt more like oil than water. I grabbed the rail, the cold metal biting into my palm, and inched toward the sliding chair. I was halfway there when the rhythm of the ocean changed again. The Aurelia didn't just pitch, she dropped. The floor vanished from beneath my feet, leaving my stomach suspended in my throat. Then the rogue wave hit. It struck the vessel broadside, a massive, dark hammer of water that rose up from the darkness without warning. The yacht shuddered violently, groaning under the impact. I lost my footing instantly. My shoes, designed for boardrooms and cocktail hours, found no purchase on the tilting, slick teak. I reached for the railing, my fingers scrabbling against the wet metal, but the angle was too steep, the force of the roll too violent. I didn't scream. I didn't have time. One moment I was fighting for balance, and the next, I was airborne. The transition from the chaotic noise of the storm to the absolute silence of the ocean was the most jarring part. I hit the water hard, the cold driving the air from my body in a single, agonizing rush. The darkness was total. There was no up, no down, only the crushing pressure of the Atlantic closing over my head. I kicked, instinct taking over, but my clothes betrayed me. The heavy linen trousers, the cashmere sweater, the tailored jacket, they all drank the sea, turning from symbols of status into anchors, dragging me down. I opened my eyes, but the salt stung them shut. Panic flared, hot and bright in my chest, warring with the freezing cold. I thrashed, my hands grasping at nothing but fluid, heavy water. My lungs burned, screaming for oxygen that wasn't there. I realized, with a clarity that was sharper than fear, that I was going to die. The silence of the deep was indifferent to my net worth. It didn't care about my schedule. It only cared about gravity. I was sinking, the lights of the surface fading into a distant, blurry memory. And for the first time in my life, I had absolutely no leverage left to use against the dark. My lungs were burning, a distinct, fiery ache that signaled the end of the negotiation. The ocean didn't bargain. It simply took. The cold had seeped past my skin, into the marrow, turning my blood to slush. The panic that had thrashed inside me began to quiet, replaced by a terrifying, narcotic lethargy. I stopped fighting the heavy linen of my trousers. I stopped reaching for the surface that felt miles away. The dark was absolute, a velvet curtain drawn over a play that had ended too soon. I was a CEO, a visionary, a woman who commanded rooms of powerful men, and I was about to become a statistic in a maritime accident report. Then the water exploded. It wasn't a wave this time. It was a focused, violent intrusion from above. A lifeline snake-whipped past my face, bubbling through the black, followed immediately by a dark shape crashing through the surface tension. The impact sent a shockwave through the water that rattled my teeth. It wasn't debris. It was a body. Reese didn't swim to me. She propelled herself. She moved with a violence that matched the storm, cutting through the resistance of the water with terrifying efficiency. There was no hesitation, no searching. She found me in the dark as if I were a beacon. Her hand clamped onto the lapel of my soaked jacket, her grip bruising and absolute. It wasn't a touch of comfort. It was an assertion of ownership over my survival. She didn't pull me up gently. She yanked, a sharp, jarring motion that snapped my head back and forced the gasp from my burning throat. She wrapped an arm around my chest, locking me against her side like a piece of cargo. I tried to help, tried to kick, but my limbs were lead. I was useless, a liability wrapped in cashmere. Reese didn't care. She kicked for both of us, her legs driving us upward with a power that felt mechanical. I felt the tension in her body, the hard line of her muscles rigid against my back. The ocean fought us. The current grabbed at my legs, trying to drag me back down to the silence. But Reese was stronger. She was the anchor that refused to drift. We broke the surface in a chaotic rush of foam and noise. The wind howled, a deafening scream compared to the quiet below. I gasped, choking on a mixture of air and spray, my lungs seizing in painful spasms. Reese didn't give me time to recover. She swam us toward the stern, fighting the swell that threatened to smash us against the hull. "Grab the rail!" Her voice was a raw command, shouting over the roar of the wind. I couldn't. My hands were frozen claws. She realized it instantly. She didn't wait. She grabbed the swim platform's ladder with one hand, her other arm tightening around my waist until I couldn't breathe. With a grunt of exertion that I felt vibrate through her chest, she hauled us up. The transition to the solid deck was brutal. Gravity returned with a vengeance, slamming my body down onto the hard fiberglass of the swim platform. I collapsed, retching, salt water pouring from my mouth and nose. I was shivering so violently, my teeth clacked together, a rhythmic, uncontrollable sound. I tried to push myself up, but my arms gave out. Reese was there instantly. She wasn't winded. She was furious. She grabbed the back of my jacket and dragged me further onto the deck, away from the hungry reach of the waves. She pinned me down, her hands heavy on my shoulders, ensuring I didn't slide back into the dark. "Breathe," she ordered. It wasn't a suggestion. I looked up, vision swimming. She was hovering over me, water streaming from her hair, her uniform plastered to her skin. Her chest heaved, not with panic, but with the aftermath of exertion. She looked wild, elemental, terrifying. And then she leaned closer, checking my eyes for dilation. Her breath hit my freezing ear, hot and ragged, a sudden, shocking contrast to the ice in my veins. The deck vibrated beneath us, the engines humming deep in the belly of the ship, but all I could feel was the heat of her body shielding mine from the wind. The distance between employer and employee had dissolved in the salt water. There was only the savior and the saved, and the air between us was suddenly, dangerously charged. She didn't ask if I could walk. She knew I couldn't. My legs trembled violently, feeling like they belonged to someone weaker. Reese didn't waste breath on reassurances. She hooked an arm under my knees, lifting me with a grunt lost to the wind. I was dead weight, sodden and shivering, but she carried me like a loose sail needing stowing. We didn't head for the master suite. The plush stateroom I had paid thousands for was too far and irrelevant. She kicked open the door to her quarters, small, utilitarian, and aggressively warm. It smelled of diesel, old paper, and ozone. She kicked the door shut, sealing out the storm, and deposited me onto a narrow bunk. The silence was sudden, broken only by my chattering teeth. I tried to curl into a ball, but Reese was there, filling the cramped room. The hierarchy of the Aurelia had evaporated the moment I hit the water. Surrounded by her charts, I wasn't the client. I was a casualty. "We need to get these off," she said. Her voice was flat, stripped of deference. "Hypothermia sets in fast, and you're already blue." I tried to reach for the buttons of my blouse, but my fingers were useless, frozen into clumsy claws. I fumbled, frustration rising like bile. I was Tessa Vance. I merged corporations. I didn't fail at unbuttoning a shirt. Reese watched me struggle for 3 seconds before her patience snapped. "Stop," she ordered. "Let me." She stepped into my space, knees brushing mine. The proximity was sudden. She didn't ask for permission. She took control. Her hands were cold from the sea, but burned against my freezing skin. She worked with terrifying efficiency, fingers nimble as they undid the buttons I couldn't manage. There was nothing romantic about it. It was a medical necessity, a tactical operation. But the intimacy hit me harder than the wave had. She peeled the wet silk from my shoulders, the fabric clinging to my skin like a second, freezing layer. I shivered violently. Reese didn't flinch. She tossed the ruined blouse into the corner, eyes never leaving her task. She moved to the waistband of my trousers, knuckles grazing the skin of my stomach. I gasped, the sensation electric. "Sorry," she muttered, though she didn't sound sorry. She sounded focused. "Lift your hips." I obeyed. I had no choice. I was entirely at her mercy, stripped of my armor, my status, and my dignity. The heavy linen trousers, now dark with seawater, were peeled away, leaving me in my underwear, shivering and exposed under the harsh LED light. I felt small. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding the leverage. I was just a body, fragile, relying entirely on another woman to keep my heart beating. Reese didn't ogle. Her gaze was clinical, scanning for injuries. But as she reached for a stack of heavy wool blankets, her eyes met mine for a split second. The look wasn't professional. It was dark, adrenaline-fueled, and raw. It acknowledged the shift. It acknowledged that she had seen me undone. She wrapped the blankets around me, tucking them tight, swaddling me like an infant. The wool was rough, scratching against my sensitized skin, but the friction was grounding. It forced me back into my body. Reese leaned in close to check the seal, face inches from mine. I could see the droplets of salt water caught in her eyelashes, the dilation of her pupils. She smelled of the storm and something deeper, musk and capability. "Stay here," she commanded, hand lingering on my shoulder, the weight heavy and possessive. "I need to check the bridge. If you move, I will tie you to this bunk. Do you understand?" I nodded, mute and trembling. I understood perfectly. The boardroom was a million miles away. Here, in the churning gut of the Atlantic, she was the only law that mattered. The world outside the porthole was a screaming void. But inside the cabin, time had pooled into a thick, syrupy stillness. The storm was a furious, abstract concept, a violence happening to someone else, somewhere else. Here, the universe had shrunk to the dimensions of a 6x8 steel box, lit by the amber glow of a single reading lamp. The air was dense, smelling of diesel and damp wool, a sensory cocoon that felt safer than any boardroom I had ever commanded. I lay there, the vibration of the engines traveling up through the mattress, a steady mechanical purr that whispered, "Alive, alive, alive." I drifted. My mind was a fractured kaleidoscope of images, the wall of water, the lights fading, the crushing silence of the deep. Every time I closed my eyes, the sensation of falling returned, a vertigo so acute my hands would spasm, gripping the rough wool of the blankets until my knuckles turned white. I was in a fever state, not from infection, but from the sheer, overwhelming chemical dump of survival. My body couldn't decide if it was freezing or burning. Shivers would rack my frame, violent and jagged, followed by flushes of heat that made the heavy blankets feel suffocating. Reese was the anchor. She sat on a low stool, bolted to the floor, legs stretched out, watching me with a vigilance that felt religious. She hadn't changed. She was still soaked, her uniform dark and heavy with seawater, a puddle forming slowly around her boots. She didn't seem to notice the cold. She was entirely focused on the rise and fall of my chest, tracking my respiration like she was reading a gauge on the bridge. "Drink," she said. She stood and moved to the bunk, a glass in her hand. The movement was fluid, despite the exhaustion that etched deep lines around her eyes. She sat on the edge of the mattress dipping under her weight, pulling me slightly toward her. It was a shift in gravity I welcomed. She held the glass to my lips. It wasn't water. The smell hit me first: peat, smoke, and oak. Whiskey. I took a sip, my hands too shaky to hold the glass myself, so she held it for me. Her fingers brushed my chin, rough and calloused, a friction that sent a jolt straight to my spine. The liquid burned going down, a golden fire that warred with the ice in my marrow. "I shouldn't have ordered us out," I whispered. The words scraped my throat, raw from the salt water. It was an admission that cost me. I wasn't a woman who admitted fault. I was a woman who spun narratives. But the ocean had washed away the spin. I was arrogant. I almost killed us. Reese didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell me it was okay, or that anyone would have made the mistake. She simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "You did," she said. Her voice was low, stripped of the command tone she used on deck. It was intimate now, a rumble that vibrated in the small space. "The sea demands respect. You tried to buy it. Today, you learned the currency is different out here." She set the glass down on the floor and leaned in. "Give me your wrist." I extended my arm from the cocoon of blankets. It looked pale and fragile against her tanned, weathered hand. She pressed 2 fingers to my pulse point, her touch clinical but lingering. I watched her count, her lips moving silently. Then, without asking, she moved her hand to my forehead, then down to the side of my neck. The contact was electric. Her skin was cool, but the heat radiating from her body was undeniable. She wasn't just a captain anymore. She was a physical force. My eyes traced the line of her jaw, the way a droplet of water tracked down the column of her throat and disappeared into the collar of her shirt. The white fabric, soaked through, had become translucent, clinging to her like a second skin. It left nothing to the imagination. I saw the definition of her shoulders, the solid muscle of her arms, the dark outline of a sports bra beneath. She smelled of rain, of adrenaline, of the wild ocean air that she seemed to carry with her like a perfume. "Pulse is steadying," she murmured, her thumb brushing the hollow of my throat. She didn't pull away. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, the medical context evaporated. She was looking at me, and I was looking at her, and the air between us was suddenly so thick it was hard to breathe. "You're warm," she noted, her voice dropping an octave. "I'm burning," I confessed. And I wasn't talking about the fever. She held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement passing between us in the dim light. Then she pulled her hand back, the absence of her touch leaving a cold ache on my skin. She sat back, but she didn't leave. She stayed, a dark, wet sentinel in the corner of the room, watching over the wreckage she had saved. I closed my eyes, the scent of whiskey and storm filling my lungs. And for the first time in my life, I let someone else keep watch. Morning broke not with a whisper, but with a blinding, aggressive clarity. I woke to a stillness so profound it felt heavy, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums where the roar of the wind had been. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary of shadow. It was stark, utilitarian, and bright. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight cutting through the porthole, indifferent to the violence of the night before. I lay there for a moment, disoriented, my body aching in a way that felt structural, as if my bones had been taken apart and reassembled slightly wrong. I sat up, the wool blanket falling away. I was alone. The stool where Reese had held vigil was empty, pushed back against the bulkhead. For a fleeting, terrifying second, I wondered if I had hallucinated the rescue, if the storm, the water, and the woman were just fever dreams conjured by a brain starved of oxygen. Then I looked down at my arms. The evidence was painted in shades of violent violet and blue. 4 distinct fingerprints circled my left bicep, and a matching set marred my right. They were bruises, ugly and dark against my pale skin, but they were the most beautiful things I had ever seen. They were the map of her grip. They were the physical proof that when gravity tried to claim me, Reese had simply refused to let go. I traced the marks with my fingertips, wincing slightly at the tenderness. The pain was sharp, grounding. It told me I was solid. It told me I was here. I needed air. I needed to see the world that hadn't swallowed me. I found a spare crew shirt folded neatly on the end of the bunk, gray, soft, smelling of laundry soap and faint diesel, and pulled it on. It was too big, the sleeves hanging past my hands, but I rolled them up and pushed open the heavy steel door. The Aurelia was silent. No engine hum, just the gentle lap of water against the hull. I climbed the companionway, my legs feeling steadier than the night before, though a phantom sway still ghosted through my equilibrium. When I stepped onto the aft deck, the contrast was blinding. The sky was a polished, impossible blue, scrubbed clean by the storm. The ocean, which had been a churning black maw hours ago, was now a sheet of turquoise glass, innocent and serene. It felt like a lie. Then I saw her. Reese was on the foredeck, back to me, inspecting the windlass. She had changed into fresh fatigues, a crisp navy that looked sharp against the morning light. I stopped by the bridge wing, staying in the shadow, and just watched. In the boardroom, I studied balance sheets and acquisition targets. Here, I studied her. She moved with an unselfconscious grace that was mesmerizing. She wasn't performing, she was working. And there's a specific, potent intimacy in watching someone who is master of their domain. She leaned over the railing to check the hull, her core engaging, balance perfect. I watched the muscles in her back shift under the fabric of her shirt as she hauled on a heavy line, coiling it with rhythmic, practiced movements. There was no wasted energy. Every motion was economical, precise, necessary. I realized then that my attraction wasn't just gratitude. It was something stickier, darker. I had spent my life surrounded by people who postured, who wore power like a costume. Reese didn't wear power. She generated it. She was the physics of the ship made flesh. Watching her hands, those same hands that had left bruises on my skin, manipulate the heavy ropes with such casual strength sent a flush of heat through me that had nothing to do with the sun. She must have felt eyes on her. She paused mid-coil and turned. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just looked at me, her gaze traversing the distance of the deck with the same weight it had the night before. I walked toward her, the teak warm under my bare feet. The air between us felt thin, fragile, stripped of the usual social insulation. "You're up," she said. It was a statement, not a question. Her voice was raspy, perhaps from shouting over the wind, or perhaps just from the morning air. "I am," I replied, stopping a few feet away. I leaned against the railing, careful not to look at the water just yet. I kept my eyes on her. "The storm—" "Gone," she cut in, turning back to the line, securing it to the cleat. "Blew itself out by 0400. We're drifting. Engines are off for a check." I looked at her profile, the sharp line of her nose, the wind-chapped lips, the way her hair was pulled back severely, exposing the strong column of her neck. I wanted to reach out and touch her, just to verify the solidity I had felt in the water. "Reese," I said. The name felt heavy in my mouth. She straightened, wiping her hands on her trousers, and finally faced me fully. Her gray eyes dropped to my arms, lingering on the bruises that peeked out from the rolled sleeves of the gray shirt. Her expression tightened, a flicker of something like regret, or perhaps remembrance, crossing her face. "I didn't mean to leave marks," she said quietly, nodding toward my arm. "I'm glad you did," I answered, the honesty slipping out before I could polish it. "They remind me I didn't imagine it." She held my gaze, and for a moment, the professional distance she wore like armor slipped. I saw the fatigue in her eyes, the adrenaline crash, and beneath that, a simmering intensity that mirrored my own. "I owe you everything," I whispered. "My life, my—" "It's the job, Ms. Vance," she interrupted, her voice stiffening, retreating back into protocol. "You go overboard, I pull you out. Standard procedure." "Don't," I said, stepping closer. The proximity alarm in my head went off, but I ignored it. "Don't reduce this to a line item in a job description. You know it wasn't just procedure." She didn't back away. She stood her ground, smelling of salt and coffee. She looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the denial warring with the truth in her eyes. She wanted to dismiss it, to file it away under crisis management, but she couldn't. The memory of the water, of my body pressed against hers, of the heat in the cabin, it was all still there, vibrating in the space between us. "The job is to keep you safe," she said finally, her voice dropping lower, softer. "You're safe. That's what matters." "Is it?" I challenged gently. She didn't answer. She just held my gaze for a beat too long, the silence stretching, filled with the unsaid. Then she cleared her throat and turned back to the horizon. "I have to check the hydraulics below," she said, the dismissal clear but lacking conviction. "Stay on deck. Enjoy the sun." She walked away, her boots thudding softly on the teak. I watched her go, my skin prickling, knowing that the storm might be over, but the real turbulence was just beginning. I waited exactly 3 minutes before disobeying her direct order. The sun on the aft deck felt performative, a bright, shining lie that tried to erase the darkness I had just survived. I didn't want the lie. I wanted the anchor. I wanted the person who had looked the storm in the eye and didn't blink. I found the access door to the engine room, disguised as a panel in the crew mess. As I opened it, the humid, heavy air hit me. A wall of heat, noise, and the sharp metallic tang of oil. This was the heart of the Aurelia, the dirty, thumping reality beneath the polished veneer. I descended the steep metal stairs, the temperature rising with every step, until my oversized gray shirt clung to my back. The space was cramped, a cathedral of chrome and steel piping that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent strips. The roar was a physical thing, a vibration that rattled in my chest, drowning out the polite silence of the decks above. Reese was wedged into a narrow gap between the starboard engine block and the bulkhead. She had stripped off her outer jacket, leaving just a tank top that was already dark with sweat between her shoulder blades. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, watching her. She was wrestling with a hydraulic coupling, her muscles cording with effort as she torqued a wrench. She looked powerful, capable, and entirely in her element. She wasn't performing for a client here. She was keeping the beast alive. She sensed me before she saw me. She didn't startle. She just paused, exhaling a breath that puffed out her cheeks, and turned her head. A smudge of grease streaked her cheekbone. War paint for the mechanic. "I told you to stay on deck," she shouted over the engine hum, though there was no real heat in it, just a statement of fact. "I don't take orders well," I shouted back, stepping off the landing and into the narrow aisle. "Besides, you look like you could use a second pair of hands." She snorted, a sound of genuine amusement. "Unless you have a degree in hydraulic fluid dynamics, you're just a fire hazard down here, Vance. Try me." She looked at me then, really looked at me, assessing the stubborn set of my jaw. She held out a hand, palm open, fingers stained with oil. 7/8 wrench, top of the red toolbox. Don't drop it. I found the tool, the metal, cool and heavy in my hand. I moved into the gap with her. It was impossibly tight. To reach her, I had to slide in sideways, my chest brushing against her back, my hip pressing into her thigh. The proximity was instantaneous and overwhelming. The air in the gap was 10 degrees hotter, thick with the scent of engine oil and her own musk, salt, sweat, and heat. I reached over her shoulder to pass the wrench. As she took it, her fingers brushed mine. It wasn't a gentle graze. It was a collision of friction. A spark, literal or imagined, snapped between us. She froze. I froze. For a heartbeat, the engine noise faded into the background, replaced by the thudding of my own pulse. "You're hovering," she murmured, her voice low, right near my ear. She didn't move away. "I'm supervising," I countered, my voice breathless. She turned in the tight space, a maneuver that required her to press her body fully against mine to clear the engine block. Suddenly, I was pinned between the warm vibration of the machinery and the solid, unyielding wall of her body. She rested one hand on the bulkhead above my head, effectively caging me in. The wrench dangled from her other hand, forgotten. "You're a long way from the boardroom, Tessa," she said, using my first name like a weapon. Her eyes dropped to my lips, then back up to my eyes, dark with a challenge that had nothing to do with mechanics. "Why are you down here? Really?" "Because it's quiet up there," I admitted, the truth slipping out under the pressure of her gaze. And I'm tired of quiet. I want to know how things work. Things break down here, she warned, leaning closer until I could feel the heat radiating off her skin. It's dirty. It's dangerous. And you can't buy your way out of a blown gasket. I'm not trying to buy anything, I whispered, looking up at her, refusing to shrink back. No? She tilted her head, a slow, sultry smile playing on her lips. A tease, a threat, a promise. She shifted her weight, her knee pressing firmly between mine, claiming the space, claiming me. Then you're just playing with fire. Careful, boss. You might get burned. The anchor chain ran out with a heavy, rhythmic clanking that echoed off the limestone cliffs. A sound of finality that signaled the end of our movement. We had tucked the Aurelia into a cove that felt like a secret, a crescent of deep, calm water, shielded from the open sea by a jagged arm of rock. The violence of the storm and the mechanical heat of the engine room felt like a lifetime ago, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The water was glass calm, an obsidian mirror reflecting the first few stars that dared to blink into existence above us. Dinner was served on the aft deck, but the white glove service I usually demanded had vanished. The crew had been dismissed to their quarters for a well-earned rest, leaving just the two of us in the soft glow of the deck lights. It wasn't the multi-course gastronomic performance my chef usually prepared. It was simpler, more honest. A loaf of crusty bread, a block of sharp cheese, some cured meats, and a bottle of heavy, dark red wine that Reese had uncorked with a casual efficiency. We sat across from each other at the small teak table, the formalities of employer and employee dissolving with every pour of the wine. Reese had changed into a clean linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the tanned, capable forearms that had saved my life. She looked relaxed, leaning back in her chair with a glass in hand, but her eyes never lost that sharp, assessing quality. She watched me over the rim of her glass, her gaze steady and unflinching, dismantling my defenses without saying a word. "You didn't scream," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "When you went over. Most people scream." I didn't have the breath, I admitted, breaking a piece of bread. And honestly, part of me wasn't surprised. It felt inevitable. Reese set her glass down, the sound sharp against the wood. Inevitable? You were standing on a wet deck in a Force 8 gale. That's not fate, Tessa. That's physics. It wasn't just the storm, I confessed, the wine loosening the knot in my chest. I looked out at the dark water, avoiding her penetrating stare for a moment. I told you I came here for silence, but the truth is, I was drowning long before I hit the water. My life back in the city, it's a cage of my own making. Every board meeting, every merger, every demand, it was all just water filling up my lungs, inch by inch. I couldn't breathe there anymore. When I fell, when the ocean took me, it didn't feel like a new sensation. It just felt like the outside finally matched the inside. I looked back at her, expecting judgment, expecting her to tell me I was a spoiled rich woman romanticizing trauma. But she didn't. She sat perfectly still, her expression softening into something that looked dangerously like understanding. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't offer a platitude. She just listened. Her stillness a comfort that anchored me more than the chain holding the ship. "Some people seek the storm because the calm is too loud," she said, her voice low and rough, like velvet dragged over gravel. "But you can't live underwater, Tessa. Eventually, you have to surface." "I know," I whispered. "I just didn't know how to find the surface until you pulled me there." The air between us shifted then, thickening with a sudden, heavy tension that had nothing to do with the conversation and everything to do with the way her eyes dropped to my mouth. The gratitude that had been simmering in my veins began to boil into something else, a hunger that was sharp and demanding. We finished the wine in silence, the kind of charged quiet that precedes a lightning strike. When we moved into the main lounge, the atmosphere changed instantly. The climate-controlled air was cool, but the space felt small, intimate. I stood by the plush sofa, feeling unmoored, unsure of the rules in this new territory. Reese didn't sit. She closed the distance between us, stopping just inside my personal space. She smelled of sea salt and the faint, clean scent of soap. Her presence was overwhelming, a gravitational pull I couldn't resist. She looked at me, her gaze traveling over my face with a slow, deliberate precision that made my breath hitch. "You're safe now," she murmured, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in my chest. "The storm is gone. The water is calm. You're back on solid ground." She took a step closer, her heat radiating against me, forcing me to tilt my head back to hold her gaze. "So tell me, Tessa," she challenged, her eyes dark and dilated. "Now that you're not drowning, what do you want?" I didn't answer with a list of demands. I answered by stepping into her space, erasing the safety margin. "I want to know if you handle everything with such precision," I whispered. Reese didn't smile. She simply nodded, a dark acknowledgement, and led me away from the luxury of the lounge. We didn't go to the guest suites. We went to her cabin. The door clicked shut, sealing us in a world of maps, leather, and silence. The room felt different now. During the storm, it had been a triage station. Tonight, it was a sanctuary. The navigational screens cast a dim green glow over the mahogany desk, and the air smelled of old paper and the sea. Reese backed me against the chart table, her hand settling heavy and warm on my waist. The contrast was intoxicating. The rough, calloused palms of a sailor against the silk of my skin. "You're used to being the one in charge," she murmured, her voice a low rumble that vibrated through my chest. She stepped closer, her thigh grazing mine, pinning me gently but firmly against the wood. "Out there, you're the CEO. In here, you're just mine." My breath hitched. It was a surrender I hadn't known I was craving. "Show me," I challenged, though it came out as a plea. She took her time. This wasn't the frantic urgency of the rescue. This was a slow, deliberate dismantling of my defenses. She traced the line of my jaw with a thumb that was rough like sandpaper, the friction sending sparks racing down my spine. She unbuttoned my shirt with maddening slowness, her eyes tracking every inch of skin she revealed, reading me like one of her charts. My hands gripped the edge of the desk, crinkling the edges of a navigational chart. I felt the topography of the coastline beneath my fingers, but my reality was entirely focused on the woman standing between my legs. "Ask for it," she whispered, her lips brushing the sensitive cord of my neck, her breath hot and teasing. "Reese," I gasped, my hands tangling in her short hair, pulling her closer. "Use your words, Tessa. Tell me what you need." "I need you to anchor me," I confessed, the truth raw and terrifying. She kissed me then, and it tasted of whiskey and salvation. It was acclaiming, deep and unhurried. Her hands roamed over me, mapping the bruises she had left during the storm, turning the memory of pain into a roadmap of pleasure. "You were so brave in the water," she murmured against my skin, her teeth grazing my collarbone. "So composed. Let's see if I can make you lose that." She wasn't just touching me. She was rewriting my understanding of touch. In my world, touch was a handshake, a sterile agreement. Here, it was communication. It was the rough slide of her palm up my ribcage, the calluses catching on my skin, a friction that felt more honest than silk. It was the weight of her body pressing me back, the unyielding strength I had witnessed on the deck, now turned toward pleasure. I felt small again, but not helpless. I felt chosen. Every brush of her fingers was a confirmation that I was alive, that the cold depths hadn't won. The sound of the water lapping against the hull became a rhythm to match the beat of her heart against my chest. The yacht swayed gently on the anchor, but for the first time, I wasn't fighting the motion. I was grounding myself in her weight, in the solid, undeniable reality of her body against mine. I realized then that the ocean hadn't just taken my breath away. It had cleared the space for this. This connection, this terrifying vulnerability, was the life-saving event I had actually needed. I wasn't floating anymore. I was held. The sun rose over a horizon that was impossibly clear, burning off the last of the mist. I stood on the bridge wing, coffee steaming in the cool air, not looking back at the shore. I was watching Reese through the glass. She stood at the helm, checking the morning instruments with that same beautiful, unflinching focus. Some rescues require you to be lost first. The storm broke me open, but she was the one who put the pieces back together. If this story of survival and surrender resonated with you, subscribe for more.